Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. This is a webinar where we have three panelists. Myself, I'm the Senior Policy Counsel for NJJN. We have Sejal Zoda, who's the Legal Director of the National Immigration Project of the National Lawyers Guild, and Sari Billick, who is a public health organizer with Human Impact Partners. Their full bios you can find when you registered for the webinar. And for those of you not familiar with NJJN, we lead a national movement of state-based juvenile justice coalitions and organizations, as well as a growing cadre of alumni of our Youth Justice Leadership Institute and allies and national partners. So we're all working together to shrink our youth justice systems and make what remains fair and effective, and treating youth with dignity and humanity. So I'm going to start with a few of the highlights and recommendations of our policy platform, which we issued this summer, supporting immigrant youth caught in the crosshairs of the justice system. And you can find that handout as well when you registered. You should be able to access it that way as well. So immigrant youth face many dangers by entering the juvenile justice system. One of the key ones are prolonged detention, either in secure juvenile detention facilities or in immigration detention facilities. And this is especially likely if your locality collaborates with ICE, because then those detainees are more likely to get immigration detainers holds placed on them, which will be honored, and that means that they'll be basically held in detention while an immigration proceeding is ongoing, which can take sometimes many months. So in addition, if that happens, there can be harm to the juvenile delinquency case. For example, the case may continue without the young person present, and they may even get warrants for failure to appear. So other issues that can happen are harm to the immigration legalization case, particularly with certain types of offenses like gang involvement, which I'll get to more in a moment. This can prevent youth from maintaining or gaining legal status. And then finally, deportation itself, which Sejal is going to talk more about, the school to prison to deportation pipeline. So gang allegations can also significantly harm immigrant youth, and these can just be allegations, not necessarily an arrest or even a conviction, but it can make a young person a higher priority for deportation and the target of a raid. And it can be used to hold youth in detention, for example, while their immigration case is pending. And we were hearing disturbing stories about some of these immigration detention centers. One example is a center in Virginia where a lawsuit is being brought because young immigrant youth, some as young as 14, were being held there while their immigration cases were pending, and in some horrific conditions where they reported beatings and being strapped to chairs with bags over their heads and so forth. So this is obviously very concerning, and sometimes young people can be sent to these detention centers as unaccompanied minors, which gets to the last bullet point there, which I have, which is the gang allegations can serve as a justification for a fast-track deportation of these recently arrived youth. And lastly, it can be used to deny youth a pathway to legal status. So we have a number of recommendations in our platform. I'm just going to go through some of these. One is we discourage the use of gang databases altogether. In many of the large cities like Chicago, LA, New York, this is a common way that law enforcement keeps track of people they think are involved in gangs, but unfortunately often use vague criteria. There's lack of oversight, and transparency in many of these gang databases. So in fact, in California, their auditor did a report and found many very concerning problems. So they have stopped using the gang database, have a moratorium on it right now while they are working on these issues. In Portland, Oregon, they discontinued use of the gang database altogether. If used, we recommend safeguards like notification to youth, or reviewing an appeal process to challenge inclusion, oversight of the database, and a process for purging names, and of course, blocking federal law enforcement access and not sharing it with ICE. We also recommend, we discourage using school resource officers or SROs, definitely not using them to handle routine discipline. More incidents are likely to end in arrest when you have SROs in schools, and for immigrant youth, then that can lead to deportation. We also recommend protecting confidentiality. So this, of course, is for all youth, and you should also find when you registered for the webinar, we have a handout on our platform on protecting confidentiality. It's particularly important for immigrant youth, and if you have strong confidentiality in place already, that'll go a long way to protecting youth. What we're particularly concerned about is encouraging probation and detention staff not to give out information on these youth and not to allow access, for example, to youth in detention centers. We also discourage collaborating with federal immigration authorities, and this can then lead to more sharing of information and access to immigrant youth. So one model you might want to look at is the California Values Act, which was passed last year. It does a number of things like banning immigration holds for ICE detainers in many circumstances and 287G contracts. So that's a good model to look at. We also discourage unnecessary detention. It's not appropriate to use immigration status in detaining youth in any way. It violates the JJDP-A to do so. There's no correlation between risk and immigration status, so it should never be used, for example, in a risk assessment instrument. And then we encourage you to adopt justice system policies and services that are sensitive to and affirmatively support the needs of immigrant youth and families, things like being culturally and linguistically competent, allowing youth that are immigrant youth into community-based alternative programs and so forth. And then finally, ensuring access to immigration experienced counsel. All defense counsel serving youth should understand the immigration consequences and be able to explain that to you. Finally, so this is not part of our platform, but we wanted to make you aware of some new issues of concern. OJJDP recently released RFPs for gang suppression, implementation, and planning grants, and these require compliance with 8 U.S.C. 1373, as well as a number of other federal codes related to immigration enforcement. But 1373 is concerning, but we want to make people aware that while it prohibits localities from enacting laws that would limit sharing immigration status information, it doesn't actually require that you actively gather and share this information. So if your jurisdiction has a sanctuary policy in effect, that would be consistent with 1373. You wouldn't have to get rid of that policy. The gang suppression planning grants in particular are concerning also because they prioritize cooperation with federal immigration authorities. So these mean practices such as allowing federal immigration officers to gain access to youth in detention facilities and following federal requests to facilitate youth transfers to immigration custody. So this is something to be aware of if your locality is thinking of applying for these grants. So with that, I'm going to transfer presenters now, and we're going to hear from Paige and Zoda. So give us a moment here, and we will change the screen.
Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, thank you, Sejal.
Okay, and my camera's on?
It's on.
Okay, great. So I'm going to echo some of the themes that Melissa brought up, and I'd like to provide an overview of national trends around the over-policing of immigrant youth, and as that intersects with gang issues. The criminalization of immigrant youth is not a new development, but there has been more overt focus under the current administration. President Trump himself has erroneously attempted to link gang violence to the surge of unaccompanied minors in the United States. His attorney general has labeled these immigrants as wolves in sheep clothing. They've really tried to portray this as a gang crisis. And it's not just rhetoric. We've seen this administration increase its use of gang allegations as a tool to pursue immigration enforcement against Latinx youth. Now, past administrations have long focused on gangs. This isn't entirely new, but we've never seen raids quite this large. For example, last spring, DHS conducted a 6-week nationwide gang operation which resulted in the arrest of nearly 1,400 immigrants in U.S. To date, the largest gang sweep by the Department of Homeland Security. Another program, Operation Matador, which brought together federal and local law enforcement, led to more than 400 gang arrests on Long Island. So, how does ICE decide to target individuals? What sorts of factors does the agency rely on? So one significant way in which young people are being targeted is through the schools, what we refer to as a school to deportation pipeline. And I want to acknowledge that, some schools have taken proactive steps to ensure that ICE does not come on campus. We now see ICE entering sensitive locations, hospitals, courthouses, and so many schools have tried to take proactive steps. But specifically, we are concerned about the role that school resource officers play in surveilling students and sharing information around gang investigations with local law enforcement. Now, schools generally do not share information directly with ICE, but if school resource officers are sharing information with local police units, that information, no matter how inaccurate, will make its way to federal immigration appeals. So, one example is the case of David, who's a former student at a Boston high school. He came to the United States from El Salvador in 2014, and he applied for a green card. And last year, he was involved in a nonviolent altercation at school. And for some reason, the school resource officer labeled him as a gang associate in the incident. Our best guess is it's because of the clothing that he was wearing, but we're not entirely sure. That report was then shared with an intelligence unit at the Boston Police Department, even though school officers are only to share reports involving serious crime. So that report was then accessible to state and federal law enforcement agencies, including ICE, and it set off a whole chain of events. Soon after, ICE arrested David, and once he was labeled a gang member, that information was replicated across databases, and it looked as though David had been ID'd as a gang member or gang associate in multiple places. But it all stemmed from the same source. David has no criminal record. He had no pending charges. But essentially, federal agents used pictures of him in a blue soccer jersey to support the claim that he is a member of MS-13. And because of that allegation, he was denied immigration bond and was detained for 18 months. And he had a really, a top-notch, zealous immigration attorney. I mean, in fact, she's a law professor, but ultimately, he was denied a green card and he was deported. And there are Davids, all over the country. He is not alone. We know of another teen who was stopped in a school hallway, and she was taken to the principal's office for holding a notebook scribbled with the number 503, which is El Salvador's telephone country code. But it's also the name of an offshoot of MS-13. The school then called the police, who then shared that information directly with ICE. Students have also been suspended from school and later detained by ICE for wearing Chicago Bulls jerseys, and targeted after posting the Salvadoran flag on Facebook. So these sorts of minor incidents based on very, very, tenuous, unreliable evidence, it has very much resulted in the increasing detention and deportation of. So what are other ways that ICE obtains information that someone is gang affiliated? There are really three main conduits for gang allegations. First, ICE relies on information gathering by the federal government itself, based on an encounter that a federal officer has or an investigation. And again, we have found that Department of Homeland Security determinations often involve loose classifications and specious evidence. And so, examples include self-admissions during an interrogation or interview, suspected gang tattoos or gang clothing, including the color of the clothing. Blue generally means MS-13, red generally means 18th Street Gang, right? And so if you are a non-citizen, you really can't wear the wrong color. So some examples of accessories that have been the basis for gang allegations include hats bearing the logos of Chicago Bulls, Los Angeles Lakers, and Brooklyn Nets, Nike Cortez sneakers, and Michael Jordan, shoes or shirts. Those are some examples. Officers also label youth as gang affiliated based on their residence. And so if you live in a high gang or high crime neighborhood, there's a chance that you will be identified as being affiliated with the gang. That certainly happened to someone that I represented in Chicago. It was simply based on where he lived. The most common way that ICE designates individuals as gang affiliated is through information obtained from local law enforcement. And so the manner of that sharing really varies depending on the jurisdiction. And Melissa referenced, some of these mechanisms, but local police can provide ICE with access to its gang databases, access to its gang units, or conduct joint operations through gang task force. And again, the gang labeling operates with little training and quality control. The last thing that I want to mention, the sort of third route, is that ICE contracts with private technology companies to gather open source and commercial data, right? So things like credit reports, Twitter activity, and such data mining, it involves significant surveillance and data collection. And for that reason is really troublesome and folks and youth should really be made aware of this. So for example, ICE may use a commercial vendor to screen social media data on Facebook referencing gang. That could be the basis of a gang allegation in immigration proceedings. So, how do gang allegations impact non-citizens? We talked a little bit about this through David's story. And Melissa mentioned some of this as well. Gang-related convictions, when someone is actually convicted, they certainly make immigrants ineligible for various forms of relief from deportation. But even gang allegations without any conviction, right? Again, someone's wearing the wrong clothing, it's the wrong color, you live in a high gang neighborhood, your name is in a gang database. That significantly increases the chances of immigrants being detained while their cases are pending. And, which we've really seen often makes all the difference. I mean, I've had a number of clients who, after being detained for 6 months in pretty horrendous conditions, they choose not to fight, or they choose not to appeal because it's just too much. And often these detention centers are not in the cities where these individuals live, but they may be in local jails in the southeast, and they're very removed from their family. And we've actually seen suicides increase this year. And so detention, and folks don't have the same access to counsel when they're detained in remote places. We've really seen detention make all the difference. But because immigration law provides no clear definition of what does and does not constitute gang membership or association, and because formal rules of evidence don't apply in immigration proceedings, it often opens the door for immigration officials to offer flimsy or false evidence of gang involvement, and to take a wide and largely uncontestable interpretation of the term. And and there's an Intercept article actually of one immigration official actually admitting that he made up allegations of gang involvement in the bond hearing, in the hearing to determine whether the individual will be detained, just so the person wouldn't get bond. So what sorts of trends are we seeing in immigration proceedings? Based on a national survey done by the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, some findings include that gang allegations against immigrants in removal proceedings are on the rise nationwide. That allegations are predominantly against Latinx youth. That young people are the most impacted, specifically immigrants between the ages of 18 and 20. And that where evidence is presented, it is often suspect, involving reliance on a single individual's accusation or social media pictures depicting youth wearing popular brands and sports paraphernalia. So in summary, Latinx youth are being, racially profiled by immigration officials under the pretense of gang involvement, and they're being denied second chances, even if they've turned their lives around from gang affiliation, and as a whole being denied their right to a fair day in court. But going forward, it is possible for things to get worse. So we need to be vigilant against specific threats, including increased collaboration between federal and local law enforcement. That's been, a central focus under the Trump administration. We need to be vigilant against more gang databases and more racially profiled stops. And another threat is gang legislation. Bills have periodically been introduced into Congress, feeding off the anti-immigrant and anti-gang rhetoric coming from the administration. That would make gang affiliation itself, without any sort of conviction, an actual deportation ground, making it even easier to deport people. So I'd like to close by mentioning a few, I think, measures, a few things that people can do to address gang over-policing. And I think, one of the most important things that we can do is to support local community-based organizations and immigrant rights organizers in their efforts to challenge local and federal collaboration. One example of that is organizing communities against Deportation, they're known as OCAD, they took on the gang database in Chicago, which contains roughly 130,000 names. And in conjunction with their campaign, we filed a lawsuit there to challenge the due process issues inherent in the use of the database. Specifically, individuals in these databases, they're not notified when their name is added. And once someone is in the database, there's not a process to challenge that designation. And police departments then disseminate that information to other agencies without confirming the accuracy of that information. Again, our client Wilmer, who's pictured here, he was in the database because he was spending time with his kids in his neighborhood, which had been flagged as a high gang neighborhood. And I just want to say, gang databases, they disproportionately identify African American and Latino men as gang members. For example, the Denver Police Department gang database identifies 2 out of every 3 African American males in Denver as a gang member, and 1 out of every 4 Latino men, right? So 2 out of every 3 African American men in Denver are in the gang database, and 1 out of every 4 Latino men, they're in the database. Which is, it's really shocking. In terms of this case, ultimately, we were able to have our client's name removed from the database, and this was a real first. The police department actually had to build in a process, like in terms of programming, they had to actually build in a process to remove someone's name because they had never done that before. OCAD's campaign has really helped draw attention to gang overpolicing in Chicago and to possible policy changes around the database. I think litigation is also its own policy option. One example is a case that the ACLU filed against the federal government from using these dubious claims of gang affiliation to detain people. In their cases, Saravia v. Sessions, and most of the plaintiffs there have been released from detention due to the suit. I think it's really important to call on policymakers to reject and build opposition to legislative proposals that seek to expand the use of gang allegations to target immigrants. I think that educating school officials about the risks to non-citizen youth when allegations of gang involvement are shared with ICE or local police units is also incredibly important. And I think that in schools, they often don't realize what's at stake, and that it can be an addition, and I think that this sort of campaign can be an additional basis to argue for why schools shouldn't employ SROs. It's not the only, people being targeted as gang members is clearly not the only harm that comes from SROs. And lastly, in Know Your Rights presentations to young people, I think it's very important to discuss the potential harms of social media, explaining to kids what's public, what could be accessible by ICE, and why seemingly benign use of social media can present risks for immigrants. So I think I'm done, and I'm going to pass it over to Sari now.
My name's Sari Billick, and I'm an organizer with Human Impact Partners based out of Oakland. So today I wanted to talk about some of the health impacts of both the juvenile justice system as well as immigration enforcement, and how juvenile justice advocates can bring public health partners into their work. So I wanted to just start with a little bit about Human Impact Partners. We're a national nonprofit that is working to transform the policies people need to live healthy lives by increasing the consideration of health equity in decision making. So through research, advocacy, and capacity building, our vision is to bring the power of public health to movements and campaigns for a just society. And we focus on several issue areas, including immigration, criminal justice, economic security, housing, land use, and transportation. And to understand our approach, I want to just share how we think about power and oppression really briefly. We believe that everyone has the right to be healthy and happy, regardless of nationality or legal status, race, ethnicity, gender, income, sexual orientation, ability, education, age, geography, and criminal record. And we also believe that our individual health is interconnected to our communities. So we live in relationship to each other. And we know that the inequities in the social determinants of health, things like housing, wages, and education, drive health inequities, and we focus a lot of our attention on addressing this. But we're also looking at what drives those inequities. So we're looking at the unequal distribution of power between communities and the ways in which those power imbalances are maintained by different forms of oppression. So racism, classism, sexism, et cetera, are about reinforcing power and privilege. And we believe that we have to understand and address this distribution of power in order to create health equity. So as part of our advocacy work, we're engaging public health professionals to be active in social and racial justice work. And we do this through two different programs that I wanted to talk about today. The first is Public Health Awakened, which is a national network of public health professionals organizing for health equity and justice. And we formed a response to the Trump administration, and we're fiercely pushing back with our public health knowledge and voice against the attacks on our health and our communities. There's been a lot to respond to in the last 2 years, but one issue that we focus on a lot through Public Health Awakened is immigrant rights and using a public health lens to support immigrant communities. Another program we have is the Health Instead of Punishment program, which uses research and advocacy with grassroots partners to build capacity of public health agencies to engage in criminal justice reform. So we do this by building partnerships between criminal justice and juvenile justice advocates and public health practitioners, advancing an alternative vision for the criminal justice system, and activating public health professionals around criminal justice reform. So just a little bit of a background about how we think about immigration policy. When used unfairly, the immigration system can perpetuate structural racism. Through it, we as a society decides who belongs and who is other. And by structural racism, we're talking about the norms in our culture based on generations of institutional and cultural practices that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with people of color to endure and adapt over time. We know that our immigration policy was already pretty broken before the Trump administration entered the White House. So this is just a quote from the American Immigration Council. The federal government has, for nearly 2 decades, been pursuing an enforcement-first approach to immigration control that favors mandatory detention and deportation over the traditional discretion of a judge to consider the unique circumstances of every case. The end result has been a relentless campaign of imprisonment and expulsion aimed at non-citizens, a campaign authorized by Congress and implemented by the executive branch. So if you've been following the news, you know it's been a constant assault on immigrants and communities of color. And I just want to really quickly run through like a couple of the major things that have happened in the last year, which you're probably familiar with. So in September of last year, Trump announced an end to the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival, or DACA program, putting 800,000 young immigrants who came to the U.S. as children at risk of deportation and losing their ability to work in the U.S. While the program has not yet ended, the fate of DACA is still caught up in legal battles. Over the past year, the administration has ended temporary protected status, or TPS, for 300,000 immigrants from 6 countries. Many TPS recipients have been in the U.S. for decades. They have children and family who are citizens and are deeply integrated into the economy and now risk deportation as well as losing their jobs, homes, and businesses. And in April of this year, we know that Jeff Sessions announced the zero tolerance policy of prosecuting all individuals who attempt to cross the border as criminals and forcibly separating them from their children and detaining thousands of children in makeshift detention centers across the country. And throughout all this, we've seen continued ICE raids in homes, workplaces, and public spaces, and assaults on sanctuary cities. And I want to share just a few numbers to put the current political context in perspective. There's an estimated 11 million undocumented immigrants currently living in the U.S. 4,500,000 children who are U.S. citizens live in families in which at least one person is undocumented, and over 150,000 children per year have a parent deported. It's important that we remember that deportation and the threat of deportation not only affects undocumented people, but also their children and family members who may be documented, anyone perceived to be an immigrant based on skin color or other factors, and other people with whom they share communities or schools, as well as our broader society. And then we know that in July of this year, Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar said that under 3,000 children had been separated from their families and were still in federal custody. And just to be clear, there's never been an accurate count of how many children were and still are detained. And although Trump signed an executive order that stopped this practice, there's still hundreds of children who are separated from their parents, and there's no clear path to reunite them. So immigration and criminal justice are not issues that public health often addresses. However, at Human Impact Partners, we believe that the current criminal justice system and the immigration enforcement system are a direct contradiction to public health values and principles. Values of equity, valuing every life, and preventing harm. And there's therefore an opportunity to engage public health partners around both of these issues, as well as at the intersections. So while Human Impact Partners haven't done a lot of research specifically at the intersection of immigration and juvenile justice, we do know that both immigration enforcement as well as involvement in the juvenile justice system have profound impacts on the health of youth and their families as well as their communities. So to get a little bit into the health impacts, there are many ways that immigration enforcement and even just the fear of deportation can affect people's health. People are afraid to drive, they can be afraid to use parks or exercise outdoors, afraid to use public services like clinics, as well as being afraid to get involved in their communities. Research shows that the fear of deportation or deportation itself of a parent or a loved one affects kids' health and family health and can lead to poorer child health, poorer child educational outcomes, poorer child behavioral outcomes, as well as poorer adult health and shorter lifespans. So as part of our research on the health impacts of deportation and detention, we did a survey that showed that deportation or the threat of deportation caused stress and trauma, including mental health issues among kids. So nearly 1 out of 3 undocumented parents in the report said that their U.S. citizen kids are afraid either all or most of the time. Nearly half said that their child had been anxious, and 3/4 said that their child had shown symptoms of PTSD. Other research we found showed poor birth outcomes. So a recent study found that 24% increase of low birth weight among infants born to Latina mothers after a major immigration raid when compared to birth weights before the raid. Research has also shown that a fear of deportation makes law enforcement more difficult. So people who are witnesses or are victims of a crime are less likely to report the crime or cooperate as witnesses if they fear deportation or questions about immigration status for themselves or someone they know. It makes victims of violence less likely to go to the police. So domestic violence victims in particular often remain with their abuser rather than risk being detained or deported when seeking protection from that abuse. And it exacerbates mental health issues. So both documented and undocumented immigrants experience exacerbated health conditions like stress, anxiety, and hopelessness due to fears of deportation for themselves or for members of their family or community. And then our research on the criminal and juvenile justice system shows clear impacts on the health of youth and adults within these systems. So differing incarceration rates and everything that drives them are a public health issue. The same structural and institutional racism that drives mass incarceration also drives health inequities. A research project that we did on youth arrest in Michigan showed that youth arrests lead to negative physical and mental health outcomes, as well as impacts on education, jobs, and other factors that we know determine how healthy we are. So this chart shows that the more involvement that youth have within the juvenile justice system, the worse their health outcomes and higher their mortality rates. And we know that intertwined policies have increased police surveillance of particular communities, including youth, immigrants, and communities of color. So a couple examples of that. The war on drugs expanded police forces, and the widespread use of stop and frisk practices increased police presence in neighborhoods. Zero tolerance school discipline policies and the growth of police presence in schools has contributed to increased youth contact with police and increased youth arrests, and the increased criminalization of undocumented immigrants, as Sejal talked about, and other marginalized groups has led to people being arrested for behaviors arising in response to decreased social safety net and policies of marginalization. So here we see that the combination of immigration policy with criminal and juvenile justice policies and the increasing criminalization of immigrants and immigrant youth has profound impacts on the health of communities, both for those who are documented and those who aren't. So in 2016, as part of our Public Health Awaken network that I mentioned, we created the Public Health Actions for Immigrant Rights, or FAIR Guide, in response to the climate of heightened immigration enforcement and attacks on the rights of immigrant communities. Sorry, my thing is just telling me that I have a poor internet connection. Let me get that back up. So the FAIR Guide is made up of 9 action steps that public health departments can take to support undocumented immigrants and their families. And many of these actions overlap with the recommendations that Melissa and Sejal shared earlier. So health departments are often providing direct health services to undocumented immigrants and their children, and they can therefore be a key resource in supporting immigrant health. And barriers to accessing health can be exacerbated during times of political uncertainty. So even something as simple as putting up welcoming signage, which there's a few examples of on the screen that health departments have done, or publicly stating the agency's commitment to serving all people, or having know your rights information on what to do in case of an encounter with ICE can be extremely helpful. It's also important that health departments look at their internal agency policies and avoid collecting patient data that could be used to deport undocumented people, and that they train staff on topics such as how to specifically identify the needs of mixed status families and how to actually handle interactions with ICE at a clinic or hospital, if that were to happen. So the action steps in our guide are meant to be a starting place, and different agencies will take action in different ways depending on the context and the population they're working with. So I want to just highlight a few of the action steps that intersect with the criminal and juvenile justice systems, and again, there's 9 action steps in the guide. So one is connecting undocumented clients and their families with legal rights and community organizing groups. 2, join and build alliances that cross issue areas and include immigration. And 3, encourage and support the efforts of sister agencies, including criminal justice, to protect undocumented people and their families. So I will try to share the link if people want to see more of action steps with a little bit more information. But we know that there's countless local and national groups that have been doing this work forever, and it's important that health departments use them as a resource and build relationships with these groups. We think that public health can be a powerful partner to your work as criminal and juvenile justice advocates. And at the same time, we encourage health departments to work to build alliances. There may be ways that public health can support your work, including providing data, expertise, or sharing information. And we also know that in this environment, there's many marginalized groups that are under attack, and it's important to remember that our issues are intersectional. Health departments can show up and just listen in spaces and communities where public health is not often present and start to build those relationships. So it's important to ask public health partners for support. Whether or not you already think of public health as an ally, they can provide support in this work. So a couple different ways is that public health are conveners. They can bring together a lot of stakeholders. They're often thought of as neutral and trusted, right? Everyone can get behind good health. They can provide data and expertise. They may have access to data that can otherwise be hard to come by. They're able to evaluate and monitor policy and programs. They can help connect with other agencies. As I mentioned, public health departments often run clinics and hospitals where they connect with directly impacted communities. They may be able to provide testimony or evidence at a hearing or meeting on a policy issue or as part of a campaign. And they can bring in a new narrative and framing that connects your issue to health. And this framing can often be useful to persuade decision makers. So I want to share one example of how a public health department supported criminal justice advocates in Minnesota, and this isn't specifically tied to immigration. The Minnesota Department of Health was asked by the state legislature to look at the health impacts of mass incarceration. They convened state agencies, county organizations, and community organizations in a systems matching and narrative development process. The narrative development process looked at how we can change the narrative around mass incarceration to center health and well-being rather than focus on criminalizing communities. So just a couple of the elements of that narrative that came out of the process included everyone deserves the opportunity to be healthy. We're all responsible for removing structural barriers which create unequal opportunities for health, including structural racism in the criminal justice system. Personal agency is fundamental to health equity and healthy communities, and incarceration should not remove a person's ability to determine or create a healthy future. Health includes mental health, not just physical health, and prison should not be our way of resolving substance use or chemical dependency or mental health challenges of people in communities. And mental health and substance abuse disorder are health issues, not criminal justice issues. Staying in school is essential to health. School discipline policies should support that. And people know what they need to be safe and healthy. Community wisdom should have a voice in the criminal justice system. So these are just a few examples of some of the narrative change work that they did. This work resulted in new and deeper collaborations between agencies that did not talk before on a health equity agenda. For example, the Department of Corrections and the Department of Health. An emerging narrative about incarceration and health equity, which I mentioned, conversations about what the Department of Health and other agencies can offer, particularly in the realm of data collection and analysis, and the Minnesota Association of Counties doing work on the public health agenda. So the Minnesota example is just one way that criminal and juvenile justice advocates can engage public health as partners. There's a lot of other examples, and we're really excited to see new and emerging partnerships in this work. In our current climate, we know that immigrant youth are particularly at risk for involvement in the juvenile justice system, as other speakers talk more extensively about. And therefore, there's a lot of creative ways to highlight these intersectional issues and work across juvenile justice, immigration, and public health. So I want to just point you to our website, which is humanimpact.org, which has a lot more resources, and you can learn more about our programs and see more of our research work there. And I encourage you to reach out with any questions. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Sari.
Yeah.
Here we go. Thank you. So we have a few minutes left for questions. If anybody would like, if you look at the screen, you can click on the hand symbol if you'd like to ask a question in person, and we're happy to unmute you to ask your question if you'd like to do that. Or feel free to write in a question and we can read it if you'd like to do that. Terry, I was just wondering if folks in a particular state wanted to get in touch with somebody that might be a public health partner, is there information about, chapters or anything like that on your website, or should they contact you, or how would that work?
Yeah, often the local health department is a good place to start. So most counties will have health departments. Sometimes there's a state health department and occasionally city and local health departments. So that's a good place to start in terms of reaching out to health departments directly. In terms of other organizational partners, most states have a public health association that you can find. And beyond that, we're happy to help connect folks to other organizations or use our contacts. And so you can contact Human Impact Partners and we can give you more connections.
Great, thank you. I'm just gonna open the question panel. Okay, so somebody wanted to know, is there a way to check whether your state or locality has a gang database? Sejal, I don't know if you can answer that.
So that's a really good question. I don't think there's a uniform answer to that. For example, we just learned that Washington, D.C. has a gang database, and we only learned that after doing a FOIA request. Someone we're representing came to us, and it was unclear why he was being targeted, and only through this FOIA request did we learn that the city has a gang database, and it hadn't published that. But if you wanted to contact me, I'd be happy to. We've done a lot of research in this area, and so we are aware of many of the cities that have gang databases, and I'd be happy to try to point you in the right direction.
And I'm also wondering, if folks just called their police department, is there any reason why they would not tell them if they had a gang database, do you think, or?
I think some cities are very open about it, and are very. And then some places have state. California has a whole state database. But our sense was that DC was not being forthcoming about it. So certainly worth trying. You have nothing to lose by calling the police department. But if the answer is no, I wouldn't assume that's that's the end of it.
Right. And then another question came in, how would an ICE attorney get access to a student's school discipline records? For example, a student suspended for suspected gang-related activity, is it legal for a school to share this?
So my sense is, a lot, any information that's protected by FERPA, ICE wouldn't be able to get. Melissa, do you know if that is protected by FERPA? Student disciplinary records?
I think those records are, but I wouldn't want to tell people definitively.
I think that the main route that we're seeing this information get to ICE is because SRO officers share it with local police. And once that information is inputted into any state and local databases, those are generally accessible to federal law enforcement agencies, including ICE. And that's how we're seeing ICE get this information. So, you know, for example, with our client Wilmer that I was speaking about before, ICE has access to Chicago's gang database, and that's how they targeted our client in a raid, in a home raid. But I'd be happy to follow up on that question. I think it would be easy for me to research, but I'm not 100% sure whether the student disciplinary records would be protected by FERPA.
Okay, well, this person said that she would appreciate that because she's writing about it right now. So.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm just looking to check if we have any more questions. We have about 2 more minutes if anybody wants to send one in. Otherwise, I'm just going to double check and okay, so I think that's all. And I just want to thank our presenters. I appreciate your expertise and your help, and thank you to everybody for phoning in. Take care. Have a good afternoon.